Released in 2005, this single-player RPG was one of the best fishing games of its time. Fate was able to capture the ambience and the serene feelings of fishing and combine it with the exotic flair of a fantasy setting. When starting a game, Fate gives you the typical choices most RPGs give you: male or female, young or old, punk or visually impaired. All of these options are available to you, and none of them will negatively affect your fishing ability, so you can pick whatever you want to. After you make your character, the game immediately hits you with a wall of text. But you didn't come here to read the terms and conditions, you came here to fish. So go ahead and skip this. When you actually get into the game, you do not start with a fishing pole for some reason. So the first part of the game involves acquiring one. Most players will skip this step and head directly into the dungeon, where they develop a self-destructive taste for the dungeon life and forego fishing entirely. You can ensure this doesn't happen to you by immediately seeking out a fishing pole. One of the merchants usually sells one for 200 gold, but you should know if you do decide to purchase one, you will find one immediately afterwards in the dungeon. Now, why would you go into a dungeon for a fishing pole or for any other reason? Because it would have been too easy to make Fate a fishing only game. In order to catch the higher levels of fish, you need to progress through the town's monster infested dungeon, the entrance of which is an unlocked door right at the edge of town. But before you go into the dungeon, you will need to take a few quests that will make it worth your while, which are offered by many of the same monsters that you will be massacring in the dungeon. At first, when choosing these, you should only accept level 1s. Once you've found 3 people willing to believe you're an adventurer, you can then begin your descent into the dungeon. All levels of the dungeon are randomly generated, and for each level, regardless of what quest you have, you will want to explore, find, and kill everything on the level, before returning to the surface or continuing down to finish any other quest you may have. Upon your return, the townsfolk may get a little excited, now that they have someone in town brave enough to go into the dungeon again, and they will begin offering you impossible quests. Refuse these, because 2 is the next level, not 4. If you can't find enough level 2 quests, you can always go in and out of the dungeon to reset the quest until you do get them. In my initial foray into the dungeon, I did notice some differences compared to my first experience playing. When I first played, the best and most efficient method of clearing the dungeon was to walk towards the nearest enemy and hit them until they were dead. And you would repeat this process throughout the whole level, taking minor healing breaks in between. However, this strategy doesn't seem to hold up in Legendary, the game's hardest difficulty. But don't worry, as outlandish as it may seem, there are alternative strategies, entirely centered on running away, which you are able to do as long as you have juice in this little yellow bar. But you have a limited supply of this, and when it runs out, things become unbearable, because you're reduced to speed walking away from enemies instead of running. Fortunately, living in the dungeon seems to be detrimental to cardio, as monsters still can't keep up with you. And your stamina does indeed recover, so you can go back to sprinting around fairly quickly. Now, this valiant strategy is incredibly effective until you come across a monster that also has a ranged weapon, or something called a resistance. When playing on easy, resistances do not matter. You simply hit the enemy with your weapon of choice until they flop on the ground, regardless of the funny words at the top of the screen. On Legendary, this is not the case, as resistances actually affect gameplay, which for the hit and run method also doesn't really affect too much. You still keep your distance and hit them with ranged attacks. Until you come across a skeleton, which the wiki incorrectly labels as the weakest undead monster in the game. Actual skeletons in Fate are abnormally fast and take little damage from the hit and run method, making them more dangerous than most bosses. However, you can have hope of eventually defeating one if you chose a dog at the beginning and not a cat, because the dog has the capabilities to fight for you. That's not to say bosses in Fate aren't difficult, because some of them definitely are, they just usually aren't skeletons. But don't worry, if you picked a cat at the beginning, all is not lost. This is thanks to the Magic Item Factory generously dumping their unused magic downstream. Because of this, fish in this game possess unique properties. In addition to the magical ability to shorten your lifespan, feeding your cat one can turn it into something useful, such as a bigger cat. But bosses are not the only difficult part of the game. As you go around the dungeon, items dropped from monsters, crates, or chests will quickly build up in your inventory, so inventory management becomes an issue. The way it works is items in the game take up spaces in your inventory relative to their size. So a handful of items that might fit in the palm of your hand will take up 4 spaces, while a shield that might fit on your back will take up something like 4 spaces. But the inventory works out well, and you usually have plenty of space. That is until you have to pick up one of these, which you can't tilt slightly for some reason. Also, you're telling me you couldn't have folded that just a little bit before putting it in your backpack? Fortunately, if you picked a dog, you will be able to not only have your dog carry items, but the dog will be able to return to town and sell those items for you at the premium rate they give all adventurers. But if, for any reason, you had to sell your items while your dog was away, or were wondering why monsters in the dungeon consistently have well-maintained and up-to-date weaponry, look no further than Getz. Just being in the same room as him gave me a second-hand charge of tax evasion, but despite any shortcomings, he remains a semi-dependable asset in the dungeon, and an oasis for health potions. As you progress through the dungeon, you will also come across these things called weaknesses. These are the counterparts to the aforementioned resistances. Normally, weaknesses will always be paired with resistances, to make it just that much more difficult. With weaknesses, you kind of just hope that they happen to align with your chosen weapons. There's really nothing else you can do to take advantage of this. Well, I mean, you could fill up half your inventory carrying 3 different loadouts at all times, so you have the ability to take advantage of every weakness you can. Or, more reasonably, when you come across a combination you can't really handle, you can just tactically reposition yourself out of the dungeon. As you work your way deeper into the dungeon, you will eventually come across various structures that each have a unique purpose. There are wells for stamina, health, and mana. There are anvils for upgrading weapons. There are shrines of learning for accumulating student loans. And then there are these ominous looking structures in the dungeon that are known as fate statues. These statues will give you the option to tempt fate, which you should do every time because there's no downside. Even in the worst case scenario, you get free experience, which goes towards leveling up. On easy, these can be spent on wherever you think would be the coolest, or don't spend them at all, doesn't really matter. But on legendary, the arrival of these points doesn't make things easier, but you are allowed to struggle with enemies on the next level down instead of dying on the first encounter, so that's something. So these points should be spent very carefully and in a way that complements the way you do combat and your playstyle to better optimize. Oh, this cool hat requires a little more dexterity. Your pet also levels up over the course of the game, and if you're playing correctly, they should be leveling up more than you. But when you do have spare points, you should be pouring as many as possible into magic, of the charm variety, because some charm spells allow you to not play the boring dungeon part of the game, so you can focus on what really matters. Fishing. I played this game in my childhood, and fishing is much less time consuming than I remember. There are 18 unique fish to catch in the game, according to the wiki, but I've caught 21. Also, this fish does not exist in the game. This doesn't necessarily mean that the wiki is wrong. The fish are just simply mutating faster than the editors can keep up. And as you catch them, you will find fish have 4 levels of rarity, which decide how long the effects of eating it last for. For the lowest level, effects last for 120 seconds. For the highest, the effects last until you feed your pet another type of fish or a dogfish. When fishing, having your inventory open is a must. I don't know what it is, but it makes the time go by so much faster. When you're fishing, there is a chance you'll pull up some treasure instead of a fish. You can pull up arms, armor, jewelry, and gems, sometimes in equal quantities as fish. And as a direct result of this, most of my equipment comes directly from the dredges of the river. In doing this, ridiculously powerful items can also be found, without ever setting foot on the 3rd level of the dungeon. You won't be able to use some of them, but you will be able to see how much your current equipment sucks. Also, you just don't catch anything a third of the time. I don't know what's up with that, but when you do catch stuff, it will eventually result in a full inventory. When this happens, I just load them all on my pet, so when they're full, they can sell it. But you can't send your pet to town if he's already there. Some legal technicality about canine commerce, I'm sure. So I hop in the dungeon, which is a similar distance away from the dock as the nearest merchant, click that go to town button, and then head to town myself. Genius. Many of the enchanted items you will be pulling up won't be identified, so it's important to put a few skill points into charm magic so you'll be able to identify as many of these as you can. You still won't be able to identify some of them, so you just throw those in your chest for when you can. These kind of just pile up along with the other essentials. Eventually, you will approach critical mass, so you will need to level up your identify skill again by going into the dungeon. This is a process that will repeat itself many times until you are very good at casting identify. There are spells in this game other than charm spells, and they allow one to harness the elemental powers of the universe and unleash them upon foes. Enemies are quickly dispatched with frightening ferocity, and survivors rarely live to tell the tale. At least I'd assume that's how they worked, but the only 2 spells I use other than summoning ones are also charm spells, and they don't do damage. So why would I use them if they're not dealing damage? They make money. The 2 spells are used to save on a couple expensive items, Town Portal and Identify Scrolls. Town portals are magical doorways that take you out of desperate situations and into town. Don't worry, the creator of the spell accounted for the fact that you probably wouldn't want those desperate situations to follow you there. But they will most definitely be there when you get back. Identify is a spell that allows you to identify the properties of a magic item, which means nothing, until you find out identified items have the potential to sell for much, much more than unidentified ones. That is, when they're not factory defects. So these are 2 indispensable spells for any player looking to make something of themselves. But how can a poor fisherman, whose total assets reside in a box under a tree, afford such expensive spells? The answer, unsurprisingly, is you don't. And if you have to go all the way to level 30 to come across your first summoning spell, consider yourself lucky, because your fate is entirely up to the dungeon. But I suppose I should address that you will come across quite a bit of money on your travels, and you may be tempted to spend it. But seeing as there's no social security programs in this backwater of a town, that money is all for retirement. But being in the dungeon isn't all fun and games. Some players do die in the dungeon. This isn't something that happens to me personally, so I'm not exactly qualified to talk about it, but I'll try to cover it anyway. Dying itself usually isn't a pleasant experience, and it gets worse when Fate shows up. Fate is an entity in the game that shares its likeness with the Grim Reaper.
Fate has unfortunately cursed you to forever walk the mortal plane, so resting in peace is not an option that he gives you. Instead, fate restricts you to three choices. The first is to resume where you left off with full health, but you lose experience and fame. The second option transports you a couple levels up or down, and you lose a little gold. The third transports you 3 levels up, but all of your gold stays where you died. The fact that you can recover all of your losses with this third one makes it the only viable option. And if you're on one of the first 3 levels of the dungeon and you happen to die to the weakest monster in the game, you get transported back to town. So that's nice. But if you're struggling on the first 3 levels, you should know that you can always rely on Drea the healer. There will never be an excursion into the dungeon that won't need her at the end. She heals you completely and removes negative effects, such as poison. Given this information, you might initially think that Drea the healer is the most helpful NPC. And you'd be initially thinking wrong, because there is an NPC that does much more than just heal you, and that NPC is Rolo. He will determine a factor about you that is much more important than your health, your social credit score. For a modest fee, he can reduce the disdainful opinions that the townsfolk have of you. So if that was the most helpful, who is the least helpful NPC? It's this guy, right here. This one. For a price that's not worth it, he can turn any item, no matter how good, into scrap metal. That's it. That's all he does. It's his profession. And when he's not doing that, he's stealing your money. The townspeople know this too, and that's why he's reduced to working out of a graveyard. There are other, more benign NPCs scattered throughout the town, but you'll be interacting briefly, if at all, with most of them. There's a collection of quest givers scattered throughout town. There are also various merchants, an armorer, a tavern keeper, a criminal, an enchantress. There's a wizard who wants you to do a quest for no reward. There's a goblin who you can pay to smash your stuff. And there's a guy you can gamble with. You'll run around speaking to some of these people, mostly for getting quests, for quite a while. But the game doesn't necessarily need to go on forever. If you're a normal fisherman, you will want to retire at some point so you can spend the rest of your days peacefully um fishing. Anyway, retirement is a key aspect of the game and it's basically what you've been preparing for your entire career. All of that time spent saving money, not buying scrolls and spells, picking up everything not nailed down and completing quests all had a purpose.
To fuel the gambling addiction that you will develop in retirement.
In Fate, gambling consists of buying an item with an unknown enchantment with the hopes that it will have a good enchantment. Will it be useful to you now that you're retired? No. After doing this and racking up enough debt to cripple the economy of a small country, you can formally retire by selling all but one of your remaining assets and fading into legend. This singular item that you pass down will become an heirloom that your future characters can use, and it will become stronger and stronger as you pass it down. I'm not sure how strong, but I'm not going to play the game 20 times, or 2 times for that matter, just to find out. When you're deciding what to pass down, you may be tempted to pass down some game breaking armor or a powerful weapon, but these have requirements. So a new character with no stats will be unable to use them. So I recommend picking something without requirements. But the game can go even further for those that are interested. While me personally would love to maintain my childish delusion that there is only one Fate game, I would just be lying to myself. In addition to the original Fate game, there are 3 others in the franchise that I assume are at least playable. But I'll save those for another day. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.